of President Trump's supporters here.
Greatest movement in the history of our country.
This week we have legendary comedian Jim Breuer from Saturday Night Live, back in the days when it was still funny. It's not a mask that he was wearing this weekend, though. I think it's a muzzle.
If he did that once in my house, go, you all right, man? Because it's a little weird the way you sniffed. Did you see the kid felt a little uncomfortable?
We learned that the Obama-Biden administration weaponized the intelligence community to take down the incoming Trump administration.
I just feel like the president has done everything with all of his heart. And when he does something, he gives all of it.
Democrats are really in for a big surprise in November.
And the Republican Party is all about individualism, and it's about freedom.
We see these promises made and promises kept.
For Hispanics from every corner of this hemisphere, they recognize that President Trump is not only willing to stand up and fight for freedom and democracy, but he is also willing to stand up to despots and dictators.
We are one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. We will make America great again.
Welcome to Team Trump Online.
I understand the pain that people are feeling. The death of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis was a grave tragedy. It should never have happened. It has filled Americans all over the country with horror, anger, and grief. We support the right of peaceful protesters, and we hear their pleas. The voices of law-abiding citizens must be heard, and heard very loudly. We will stand with the family of George Floyd, with the peaceful protesters, and with every law-abiding citizen who wants decency, civility, safety, and security. But what we are now seeing on the streets of our cities has nothing to do with justice or with peace. The memory of George Floyd is being dishonored by rioters, looters, and anarchists. The violence and vandalism is being led by Antifa and other radical left-wing groups who are terrorizing the innocent, destroying jobs. Did this for no reason. The mobs are devastating the life's work of good people and destroying their dreams.
That worked so hard to get here. So hard.
It harms those who have the least. We cannot and must not allow a small group of criminals and vandals to wreck our cities and lay waste to our communities. We must defend the rights of every citizen to live without violence, prejudice, or fear. Healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos, are the mission at hand. I stand before you as a friend and ally to every American seeking justice and peace. No one is more upset than fellow law enforcement officers by the small handful who fail to abide by their oath to serve and protect. We support the overwhelming majority of police officers who are incredible in every way and devoted public servants. We must all work together as a society to expand opportunity and to create a future of greater dignity and promise for all of our people. Every citizen in every community has the right to be safe in their workplace, safe in their homes, and safe in our city streets. We are working toward a more just society, but that means building up, not tearing down, joining hands, not hurling fists, standing in solidarity, not surrendering to hostility. This is the sacred right of all Americans that I am totally determined to defend and will defend.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Team Trump Online's War Room Weekly, where we take a better look at the difference in records between President Trump's excellent record of achievement on behalf of the American people and contrast that with Joe Biden's record of failure over the course of more than 4 decades as a Washington, D.C. insider. We will get to all of that. But first, we're joined here by U.S. Senator Tom Cotton of the great state of Arkansas. Senator Cotton, thank you very much for making time for us today.
Thank you, Tim. Very good to be on with you.
Well, you have been somewhat in the news here in the last few weeks. You penned an op-ed in the pages of the New York Times, which caused a little bit of a stir, mostly from within the New York Times newsroom and among their editors, I'm afraid to say. So you were talking about the unrest in American cities, the rioting in the streets across so many of our great American cities, and one proposal, one solution to quelling that violence. Why don't you try to explain to us what it is, the point you were making?
Sure, Tim. What we saw last weekend in so many cities, to include Washington, D.C., was not peaceful protest and demonstration. It was rioting and looting and really anarchy and insurrection. In Washington, D.C., a famous church was torched, a church that every president since James Madison has worshiped at, and our memorials were desecrated and businesses were looted. You saw the same thing in Minneapolis last weekend as well, and New York early last week. So I made the simple point that we cannot tolerate rioting and anarchy on our streets. Of course, George Floyd and any victim of the excessive use of force deserves justice in accordance with law, and we respect the rights of peaceful demonstrators, but we can have no tolerance for rioting and looting and anarchy and insurrection. And in many places, that means that the local police were simply outnumbered, and therefore we had to call in the National Guard. And if necessary, we had to be ready to use active duty troops. The president made the same point early last week. He said he didn't want to. Fortunately, we haven't had to. But there's longstanding historic precedent and legal basis going back more than 200 years for the president to do what is necessary to protect livelihoods and lives of American citizens. So I wrote an op-ed just laying out that case, laying out that history. The New York Times specifically asked me to write, and then it published on Wednesday. And let's just say it triggered a lot of the woke children that pass for writers and editors inside the New York Times newsroom.
So you made what the New York Times now is trying to claim was a dangerous point, which is that we can have lawlessness and uncontrolled rioting in our streets, and if the police are outnumbered and outmanned, that in fact we should use the National Guard, and if necessary, active duty military. They found that to be a dangerous argument to make, one that many people think that should not even be heard. That argument is so dangerous you can't even talk about it. And so now, if you go to the New York Times website to find your op-ed, you will find a lengthy editor's note that precedes the op-ed and essentially says, what you are about to read is dangerous. Warning, warning. I mean, I've never seen an editor's note quite like that. What's your reaction to the disclaimer that runs, I don't know, a couple hundred words before your piece?
Yeah. The so-called editor's note would probably be better called a trigger warning for all these little snowflakes who were coddled throughout their childhood and into college and told that they would never have to be presented with a contrary argument. You see this in college campuses, and it's clear that it's now the dominant way of thinking inside major institutions like the New York Times. I would simply note that in the 24 hours after the New York Times published my op-ed, both the editorial page editor and the owner of the New York Times publicly defended that decision. But after the mob grew and grew inside their own institution, they simply caved. They prostrated themselves and abjectly apologized as if it were a struggle session from the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China, as opposed to doing what leaders of institutions are supposed to do when confronted with criticism from their young junior employees. Tell them that they're not on campus in a social justice seminar anymore. This is the workplace, and you have to deal like adults when you're confronted with contrary opinions. And if you don't like that, you're welcome to quit.
Yeah, I saw one commenter on Twitter say that the New York Times newsroom is now turned into a liberal arts college campus, and so yeah, I think you're exactly right with that observation. One of the points that you mentioned in there is that a lot of the riots were involving outside agitators, people who had come in for the purpose of creating violence, like Antifa and other groups like that. And we now know the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, has said that he's got evidence that, yes, in fact, Antifa was involved in a lot of these cities. But the New York Times now says that because leftist interests have spoken up and don't like the idea of Antifa being dragged into this publicly, into the public discussion, they should have stricken that part from your op-ed. So is that the standard now? Even if you're going to make an argument that has a basis in fact, if the left doesn't like it, you've got to leave it out. Is that the idea now?
Apparently, it's a standard at the New York Times that if you say anything that will trigger the little snowflakes that they have working for them, then you can't make factual assertions. Look, people don't show up at peaceful demonstrations with crowbars to break into Macy's. Stacks of bricks don't get into the middle of roads by themselves. Those are not the acts of peaceful demonstrators who are understandably appalled by the excessive use of force against George Floyd. Those are the acts of radical extremists and agitators who really are nihilistic anarchists and would like to see the overthrow of our government in America. We can give zero tolerance to anyone who takes such actions, while at the same time respecting the rights of every American to protest.
Senator, another point that you made in your op-ed was that the police had borne the brunt of the violence coming through these riots. And I guess the question for the New York Times is, how many police officers and law enforcement officers being shot and stabbed and in some terrible cases actually killed? How many times does that need to happen before it's safe to say that police are bearing the brunt of the violence?
Well, apparently not dozens and dozens of cases, Tim, because last weekend and early last week, you saw dozens and dozens of police officers all around the country being wounded in these riots or during this looting, some even killed. And there's not much coverage of that in the New York Times. And as you say, apparently pointing out that fact in my op-ed triggered a lot of their young employees. Look, we should cover the deaths of innocent citizens like George Floyd, who are the victim of excessive use of force. But we should also cover it whenever police officers are injured or killed in the line of duty as well.
Now, we've seen, let me turn it towards things that are current events currently happening in the nation's capital and elsewhere. We saw that the Biden campaign, staffers from the Biden campaign contributed to a fund that was paying the bail for people arrested for rioting in Minneapolis. And now we see a growing movement among leading Democrats, and Joe Biden has to own this notion of defunding the police. That has now become the call, and it's a litmus test for Democrat office holders. Do you or don't you support defunding the police? What's your reaction to that? And what does that mean if people are actually calling for the disbandment and defunding of police departments at a time like this? What's your reaction?
Defunding the police is insane. The police are what protect us all from anarchy. Just imagine if there were no police on our streets at all to protect our homes, to protect our businesses, to protect our families. The right approach to any kind of excessive use of force by the police is to hold those police officers accountable. It's not to brand all police officers everywhere as racist and to try to disband our police. And you're right that Joe Biden and the entire Democratic Party is moving in this direction. And Joe Biden certainly is not strong enough, not capable enough of standing up to the radicals in his own party who want to defund the police. I mean, this is going to be a central issue in the campaign between President Trump, who wants to protect all Americans of all races everywhere, and Joe Biden and the radical left-wing Democrats who want to disband local law enforcement in our country.
All right, Senator Tom Cotton from the great state of Arkansas, we appreciate your time and we appreciate your efforts, despite the opposition of those within the New York Times, to keep moving the conversation forward. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Tim.
Senator Tom Cotton of the great state of Arkansas. We'll be right back.
What a beautiful history we wrote together. China's not our problem.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message. I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message. My administration will take all necessary steps to safeguard our citizens from this threat.
Hysterical xenophobia.
Be giving Americans a false sense.
Is it accurate that if these steps had not been put in place, it could have been 2 million people dead here in the United States?
Yes.
No matter how hard they try to stop us, they can't. We built the greatest economy the world has ever seen, and we're going to do it again. Together, we're beating back the invisible enemy.
What the federal government did was a phenomenal accomplishment.
Through it all, the world has witnessed the unyielding resolve of our incredible American people.
Promise made, promise kept.
And I'm fighting for you, and I love doing it with everything that I have. And you know that. With the grace of God, we will win this war, and we will win this war quickly. And we will make America great again.
Welcome back. We are now joined by two fantastic guests. Ken Blackwell, the former mayor of the great city of Cincinnati. He's also the former state treasurer of the state of Ohio and the former secretary of state from Ohio. And also Katrina Pierson, senior advisor to the Trump 2020 campaign. I want to thank them both for being here with us today. Well, there can be no question that the nation has been gripped by the terrible, terrible, horrible killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the peaceful protests that followed. And then after that, how those protests were co-opted and subsumed by violent elements, in many cases coming from outside those communities to serve as agitators and actually burn down the very communities that are being troubled by this and by the coronavirus situation of the worst. Ken, let's start with you. As you see this and you see the peaceful protests, which of course are a free expression of the First Amendment, then being consumed by the violence that erupted in so many American cities, what are your thoughts about all of that?
Well, Tim, two indispensable pillars of civil society in America are law and order and justice. And what we witnessed in Minneapolis was horrifying. It was horrifying to President Trump and most decent Americans across the country. And what we called for immediately was the arrest of the police officers and a vigorous prosecution. And we have now witnessed that. But peaceful protests and support for justice got transformed by domestic terrorists and petty criminals into an attack on America's cities that actually has led to the calling of Joe Biden and all of his supporters for disbanding police departments, rendering neighborhoods unsafe. This has to stop.
Yeah, and I think there's no question there is a growing movement among Democrats and Democrat leaders, in fact, to defund the police. We saw Washington, D.C. woke up on Sunday morning to that in very large letters painted on the street near the White House, defund the police, right alongside where the city of Washington had officially painted down Black Lives Matter. And so without question, Joe Biden owns the defund the police movement, which is exactly what we don't need in these communities that have been beset by these riots. And that's exactly why President Trump knows how important it is to keep the peace and restore law and order in these communities. Katrina, these outside agitators, Antifa, and this movement against the police department, the vast majority of men and women who were there to protect these communities. This is just the wrong way for the country to go. It's the wrong direction.
Well, not only is it the wrong direction, but I mean, it's an illogical direction. I mean, how can you have, peaceful society without law enforcement to protect the innocent? I mean, it's absurd, but nothing surprises me with the lunacy from the left. And you're right, Joe Biden owns all of this. He has fostered this, he's participated in this, he's contributed to this, he's funding this as we speak. And so I think it's really important, though, to point out also the hostile media situation that our country has. And as the president says, the fake news media is the enemy of the American people. And we're seeing that play out right now because, Tim, for the first time ever, Americans were sitting at home hearing their president being criticized for walking to church and holding a Bible. And so the media, too, is also complicit in this. Joe Biden owns what's happening in our country, but I think Americans are paying attention, and President Trump is unpredictable. He's 2 steps ahead, and they are losing their minds.
They are losing their minds. The media lost its collective mind when President Trump walked to St. John's Church the other day, and they really had a collective fit. But when Joe Biden gave remarks in a church, they thought that was just the greatest thing that they had ever seen. But here is the truth. President Trump addressed the nation twice, once 2 Saturdays ago and again earlier this week. And he was personally horrified, like almost all Americans, when he learned the news and saw the video, just like the rest of us. And here's the president from 2 Saturdays ago.
The death of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis was a grave tragedy. It should never have happened. It has filled Americans all over the country with horror, anger, and grief. Yesterday, I spoke to George's family and expressed the sorrow of our entire nation for their loss. I stand before you as a friend and ally to every American seeking justice and peace. And I stand before you in firm opposition to anyone exploiting this tragedy to loot, rob, attack, and menace. Healing, not hatred, justice, not chaos, are the mission at hand.
That is the President of the United States from 2 Saturdays ago addressing the nation. And we should note that we now know that the White House gave CNN and MSNBC a heads up that the president would be addressing the George Floyd situation at the very top of his remarks 2 Saturdays ago. And CNN and MSNBC did not carry those remarks live for their viewers. And then those networks were part of the media setting up the narrative that the president hadn't addressed the issue and hadn't spoken to the nation. So there you have, Katrina, the president of the United States doing exactly what the people expect the president to do, and the media can't stand that. And instead, they concoct the opposite narrative. It's irresponsible, is it not?
It's irresponsible. Again, that is why they are the enemy of the people. And for anyone who has not seen the president's full remarks that he gave televised, just go to our Team Trump platforms. The remarks are there. We had to put it out just to prove that the president did give such a very warm and empathetic speech about George Floyd's death and his commitment to pursuing justice and restoring law and order. It was a wonderful speech. And it's truly a shame that the media deprived the public of the president's sentiments and instead reported that he hadn't said anything. And I'm willing to bet, though, that America knows better because they know our president. They know he's America first. He has a record that's proved that. And I think this is really making the American media look even worse if that was even possible.
Yeah, and Ken, the president does, in fact, in contrast to Joe Biden, President Trump does, in fact, have a record that he can point to of great success on behalf of Americans, and in particular, Black Americans.
Oh, absolutely. Look, this president has an agenda that he's acted on from the very first day that he was sworn in to the present time. And that is to make sure that our people are safe, both from external threats and internal threats. He's, in fact, had an agenda that is focused on transforming poorly functioning and producing public schools into school districts that are emboldened by school choice and parental empowerment and providing quality education. But he's understood that one of the things, and this is why the president is so brilliant in executing his agenda, he understands that cities that are now diswrecked with underdevelopment, they need a couple of things. They need to be safe, they need quality schools, and they need a quality infrastructure. His agenda, through opportunity zones, through school choice, and through investing in our infrastructure, he wants to attract that capital into the cities, not just for extracting capital purposes in itself, but to create jobs and people can experience the dignity of work. This is a president that is committed to creating an opportunity society, not expanding the welfare state.
Yeah, that's right. The school choice is actually a very important component of that, and opportunity zones as well, which are contained in the Trump tax cuts. Joe Biden has said quite clearly that if he is president, that he would not allow charter schools and reduce school choice and keep students in failing schools in inner cities all across the country. And of course, he would repeal the Trump tax cuts, which would naturally repeal the opportunity zones, which we see causing so much success in these cities. So the president did address as well the fact that the peaceful protests, which he acknowledged and supported as being part of the First Amendment, which we all hold so dear, but those protests were co-opted by the violent element, Antifa and others. And the president says that law and order is what Americans, not only in those cities, but everywhere, deserve. Here's the president.
Innocent people have been savagely beaten, like the young man in Dallas, Texas, who was left dying on the street, or the woman in upstate New York viciously attacked by dangerous thugs. Small business owners have seen their dreams utterly destroyed. New York's finest have been hit in the face with bricks. Brave nurses who have battled the virus are afraid to leave their homes. I want the organizers of this terror to be on notice that you will face severe criminal penalties and lengthy sentences in jail. This includes Antifa and others who are leading instigators of this violence. One law and order, and that is what it is. One law. We have one beautiful law. And once that is restored and fully restored, we will help you, we will help your business, and we will help your family.
That's the message from the President of the United States: equality under the law for everybody and restoration of law and order. And on the other side, we see the growing movement in the Democrat Party, one that Joe Biden owns. They want to defund the police. Ken, let's go back to you. There could not be a more clear contrast between the two approaches.
Absolutely. And the scenes that we've seen over the last couple of days of the Minneapolis mayor, looking like a hapless sap as he tried to address his citizens, it's embarrassing, because basically those folks who are talking about defunding the police department are the same folks who are talking about doing away with our Second Amendment rights. So ultimately, any thinking person understands what they're talking about is to leave us helpless, to leave us as targets of opportunity for criminals. And believe me, if you don't have a first line of defense in a police department, and you don't have your Second Amendment rights, you will have a total breakdown of civil society. And that is something that this president will not stand for. You guys know, you've heard me say this. The folks on the left, Joe Biden, they stand on the sidelines as America rapidly becomes a culture where earning money doesn't entitle you to it, but wanting money does. That is just crazy. And we have to make sure that narrative, that mindset does not win the day. And thank God we have a president that is a leader, and he understands his first obligation to the American people is safety.
Yeah, I think that the Democrats and Joe Biden have quite wrongly calculated that all this unrest in American cities is of political benefit to them. But the fact is, without peace, there can't be any prosperity. Katrina.
Well, Tim, you're absolutely right. And even some prominent Democrats know that, considering how they've pointed out. One simple fact that the president has continued to point out is that this issue that everyone is participating in these protests about is a local issue. The people in these communities have full control through voting on how their police departments are run. And prominent Democrats have come out and pointed out that all of these cities where they're having all of these issues, what they're calling systemic racism, is happening in Democrat-run cities. And so we have to pay attention to that. And so the president has offered his resources. If he can do anything he can, he will. But the Democrats have been rooting for failure since November 2016, Tim. I mean, they were cheering for recession while the economy was still booming. They have been incessantly attacking the president with willful, fraudulent investigations that, ultimately spent tens of millions of tax dollars that went nowhere. But they were just distractions and more attempts to damage the president's relationships and the confidence with other world leaders. And not only is it disgusting, but it's childish and cowardly. I mean, have an idea, actually have a plan for America. But now we have Jim Crow Joe walking around towing the deaf and delusional line of failure. But that's all they can do because they don't have solutions. They can't solve problems. They never have. And the issues that Black America are screaming out loud about right now are compliments of Joe Biden and his 40-year stint of implementing and maintaining systemic racism that has been adopted by these Democrat communities.
Yeah, and proof of that, the Biden camp thinks that all of this is of political benefit to them, is the fact that the Biden campaign staffers bragged about having donated to a fund that was paying the bail for people arrested in the riots in Minneapolis. They were actually bailing out of jail the people who were setting fire to the businesses, largely in minority communities. And contrast that with what we did at the Trump campaign, is that we donated to one of the business owners whose lifelong dream and life savings were put into opening up a sports bar, and it burned to the ground before it could ever even open for the very first time. And so there you have the competing visions of what's right and what we should do in this country.
Absolutely. Look,
go ahead.
As a former mayor, this is one of the things I understood as a local leader. I understood, one, capitalism and capital. And capital seeks the path of least resistance and greatest opportunity. And there is no opportunity in a lawless city, in a lawless community. So bringing about social order and law enforcement is essential to attracting capital back into the cities to fuel economic growth and job creation. We have a president that understands that. Too bad for those Democrats that are following the motto of Joe Biden, because they will continue to chase capital away, and that means that their communities will be stuck at low levels of employment and not be able to take advantage of the renaissance, the economic renaissance that the president put in motion and that we're now going to reopen in a very aggressive way.
Yeah, we already see the jobs numbers that were just announced last week for the month of May. 2.5 million new jobs created just in the month of May. It's an all-time record for 1 month in the history of this country. The economic experts who are always surprised by the economic news had predicted a loss of jobs of 8.5 million. And we actually added 2.5 million. And so they were only off by a factor of about 11 million jobs. But we know, the media has covered this, people who are in Joe Biden's quarter and Joe Biden himself, they know that good economic news for America is bad political news for them. What a pathetic position to be in. Katrina, have you ever seen a situation where the country had a very serious problem like the coronavirus first and now the unrest involving the death, following the death of George Floyd? Have you ever seen a situation where one major political party is actually rooting against Americans? Have you ever seen it?
I have never seen this in America. We see this all over the world, but we don't see it here in America. The Democrats used to have the same, value system, just a different way of getting there. And now it's just anti-American, period. And even after all of the hoaxes, including the pandemic that artificially interrupted our groundbreaking economic numbers, people still bet against Trump, and Trump is a winner. He continues to lead our nation through strength and courage, making those tough decisions, saving lives, and judging by the last economic news, making America great again. While Joe Biden is sitting in his basement, trying to remember what state he's in half the time. And here we are, in the middle of chaos, and you have the media dogpiling on, which is really just hurting Americans. But again, I can't say enough that I think the American people are paying attention, and I don't think that they're very happy with what's going on. And when you see Joe Biden, trying to politically benefit and fundraise off of this, I think it's going to backfire. And the fact that he's been bailing these rioters out of jail, his campaign, to your point, bailing these rioters out of jail to go and riot some more, to go and loot some more, to go and hurt more Black businesses and hurt more Black jobs. I mean, these communities were just getting ready to open after the pandemic, and they've gone out and destroyed them. It is absolutely disgusting.
At a time when this nation should be turning towards one another, Joe Biden has the nation turning on one another. And that's the difference. President Trump is a leader of multiplication and addition. You know, Joe Biden is a leader of division and subtraction. It's clear.
Yeah, absolutely. It's clear the choice. And I'm glad you took us in that direction, because that brings us again to Charlemagne the God, who was involved in the news a couple of weeks ago when he had Joe Biden on his radio program. And when he was challenging Joe Biden on his record as sponsorship of the 1994 crime bill, which at the time and over the years Joe Biden was very proud of. But of course, we know now that it led to the indiscriminate mass incarceration of young Black Americans, of course, predominantly male Black Americans. 500% increase by some counts, and Joe Biden tried to turn the tables on him and said that if you're not voting for him, you ain't Black. And of course, that touched off a round of news. But then following that, Charlemagne was asked again about his reaction to that. He was talking about that incident. Here's some commentary after the "You ain't Black" remark from Charlemagne the God.
The statement he made was interesting, you know, because that's something I hear from other Black people. You know, it's very interesting to see that an old white man also looks at Black people in that way. Like that question, what makes somebody Black? That's a discussion for Black people to have, you know, and a white man is certainly not qualified to have that discussion. The whole system needs to be dismantled and rebuilt. And he's been a very intricate part of that system. You know, whether you're talking about, you know, in '84 with the mandatory minimum sentences for drug dealers, or you're talking about '86 with the crack laws that gave you more time for crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Are you talking about the '94 crime bill? Like he was, you know, really one of the people on the front line when it came to the war on drugs and mass incarceration.
And so there you have it. There's a critic of Joe Biden and his record, Charlemagne the God, and he is not alone in that. And that really exposes the true difference between these two men, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Biden today is masquerading and taking sides. He's siding with the rioters. Even police organizations have turned their back on him. They see he's gone so far off the deep end to the left. And President Trump is the one who has the real record. Ken, you were talking about this, and the people in these communities, if they want someone who has actually done something to benefit their communities, it's President Trump, and it's not even close.
Absolutely. Joe Biden is stuck on stupid. And thank God Americans are not. They know his record. They know his record of the '80s and the '90s, where in fact he advocated for a system that took away judicial discretion and contributed to mass incarceration. They understand that President Trump has had an agenda from day one to reform our criminal justice system, and he has delivered. Not Barack Obama, not Joe Biden, Donald J. Trump delivered on meaningful criminal justice reform. This is a president that leads, not by words, but by actions.
Yeah, and that's right. It's President Trump who has the record. And Katrina, when you were talking to the president the other day, and I know you've discussed things that happened after the "You ain't Black" comment from Joe Biden to Charlemagne, there was a tremendous uptick in outreach to the campaign from Black voters asking to get involved with President Trump's reelection effort. Tell us what the reaction has been following the "You ain't Black" comment.
Yeah, you know, kudos to coalitions and comms for being able to move so quickly, because part of the issue with Black Americans not knowing the other side is because it's very difficult to penetrate the culture. But what we were able to do is to do just that and penetrate the culture and tell people what the president has done. And since then, we've had thousands of new followers. Look on Instagram. Black Voices for Trump is now the largest Instagram following on Team Trump. That is huge for coalitions. Not only that, but we had 8,000 new signups. And this is just unheard of in presidential politics. But, you know, what's interesting to me is, you know, Charlemagne says, well, Joe Biden has to, you know, fix that. Well, it's already fixed. It's called Criminal Justice Reform and the First Step Act via President Donald J. Trump. And I've been hearing a lot of the press lately asking the president, well, you know, what's your plan and what's your agenda for Black America? And my response is, is my typical less contrite response like, what? Because President Trump, it has an American agenda. And as a Black woman, I find the question highly offensive, especially after Joe Biden, casually informing Ken and myself that we were no longer Black because we didn't support the plantation owner himself, Jim Crow Joe. But think about this for a second. In 2016, the Trump, as the candidate, didn't have a Black agenda. He didn't put out some pandering document outlining some plan for Black America. Instead, he took action, and he has delivered tangible results that directly impacted Black Americans, like the extension of HBCU funding. Previous presidents, including the Obama-Biden regime, made these chancellors of these Black colleges and universities come back every single year to kiss the ring. President Trump funded them for 10 years so that they could focus on awarding class rings, not kissing the rings of the politicians. And something else that President Trump has delivered that the Obama-Biden regime didn't bother to do was to make capital available for Black-owned businesses. And they pushed for school choice. While Biden and the Obama regime were in power for 8 years, never even attempted to make a solid push for criminal justice reform, President Trump delivered. And that is something that he's accomplished in his first term. Joe Biden put non-violent Black offenders in prison and bragged about it, while President Trump is creating generational change by undoing the damage that Joe Biden has caused in the carnage of the Black family unit, and compliments to Joe Biden for causing all of the chaos and being a part of this intrinsic problem that Black America has had for generations.
Yeah, I want to compliment you on a line in there. Class rings, not kissing the rings.
That's right.
That's a pretty good one. So let's put a fine point on this, on the economy and the economic news. As we said, in the month of May, we now know that the economy under President Trump's policies created 2.5 million new jobs. That's the highest job creation total in one single month in American history. But we also know that not everybody is yet sharing in what is the beginning, quite obviously, the beginning of the great American comeback. And again, we point to elected Democrat leaders in these blue states and in these cities who have been dragging their feet in reopening the country. And again, there is every reason to believe that if they think that politically it helps them to be slower to respond to the reopening of the country, because again, bad news for Americans is good news for Democrats. It's a very cynical ploy, but Politico, the Beltway publication that unfortunately for us, we all have to read and be aware of what they're reporting. They have reported that the economy rebounding strongly and quickly is actually, in their words, the doomsday scenario for Democrats. That's astounding. And so not only does President Trump have the record of helping all Americans, including Black Americans and including those in inner cities, and giving everyone economic choices and economic empowerment, he also has to battle the Democrats who are slowing things down and trying to throw up obstacles in everyone's path. And Ken, you were the mayor of a major American city, the mayor of Cincinnati. Would you ever have dreamed of doing something politically because you thought it would help your party or perhaps the election chances of your candidate for president that you knew would be detrimental to your own citizens? Would you ever have done that?
Absolutely not. And those mayors that do, those county executives, those governors that do, those members of Congress that do, they own the misery index in their cities, their congressional districts, and their state. You know, it's no accident that America is the most prosperous, most diverse constitutional republic in the history of the world. And Katrina, Tim, I've traveled to 63 countries as a diplomat. And let me just tell you this, that's not just talk. America is that beacon of light. It is the shiny city on the hill. This president gets it. And that's why he's in the forefront of reopening our society. We're going to have a V-shape, as he said, maybe a rocket ship recovery, because he understands, not only does he understand capital, but he understands the American spirit. And he understands that if, in fact, we don't reopen, the number of deaths, the misery, and the dysfunction will grow exponentially. He is not on his watch. And that's what the American people like about our president. He, in fact, will lead us in this reopening of American society and creating jobs and prosperity and providing the opportunity for the dignity of work.
And look at the irony. Look at the irony, Tim. I mean, you hear the economy's opening and there's jobs coming and these communities are still stuck. And it's so sad and it's tragic, but that is the irony of the Democrat Party, because it seems almost, overnight that the Democrats were just arresting people for going to church, walking on the beach alone, or just opening up their stores again, to suddenly partying in the streets, protesting, not following CDC guidelines, by the way, while they're looting and destroying private property has become this theme of police brutality. So I guess COVID isn't a thing anymore. And it's truly remarkable.
From the media's perspective, the coronavirus crisis has certainly seemed to take a hiatus. There's no question. Go ahead, Ken. Final word. We're going to
I'm just saying, look, what the mainstream media doesn't understand, and it's something that the president understands very, very clearly, is that our human rights are not grants from government. They're gifts from God. That's why this president protects religious liberty. He understands that we function best when we actually put a harness on the growth and reach of government, and we use our families as the incubator of liberty. And when that happens, prosperity abounds, and freedom and liberty is enjoyed, and we become even a greater country. That's why this president is going to be reelected, because he has not only the positive word, he has the positive agenda.
We are going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you both. Ken Blackwell, the former mayor of Cincinnati, former treasurer of the state of Ohio, and the former secretary of state for the state of Ohio. Ken, thanks very much for being with us.
We did.
And Katrina, senior advisor to the Trump campaign. As always, Katrina, it was a pleasure to see you.
Great to be on, Tim.
And I'm Tim Murtaugh, the communications director for the Trump 2020 campaign. Thank you for joining us. But before we go, I want to remind you to please download the Trump 2020 app, the official app. It lets you get involved with the president's campaign, the re-election campaign. It also gives you the straight information without the media filter right from the campaign. It'll let you volunteer and get involved. You can make phone calls to voters from the comfort of your own home, and you can also rack up points for the activities that you enter and change those points in for great prizes, including a picture of yourself with President Trump. Until next week, thank you for watching. Have a good week.
We choose truth over facts.
A composite that our sketch artist put together after interviewing Biden event attendees is unveiled.